I hope you enjoyed the tour. We really needed our lunch today after that tour. I'm sure we expended a lot of calories. Doug, thanks for lunch. It was delicious. We've had a bit of a discussion of the task force members once we returned, but we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but we thought we'd keep going, and we'll give you back as much time as we can throughout the day. The next item on the agenda was a short review by the design team. George, have you had a chance to eat yet? No?
Can I have 5 minutes, please?
Yeah, 5 more minutes, and then George will get up and start the discussion of the design team. So let's do 5 more minutes.
I would be happy to just be able to go into the and I can't change that. It's not a replacement. I use it in a tablet and a small phone. I love having a tablet. I have a tablet and I want my phone small. So I may as well have it to the size that it's useful.
Well, my brother-in-law was a Galaxy.
It's just like I got a call from the National Academy of Design. I was on a job site and they're like, put up controls. Brought up remotely, logged on to the controls, saw what the problem is, told them how to fix it. I'm like, phone. That's what it was like on the screen.
But if you had that,
Then you'd have to have a separate account. Just get a
put that in.
tether this with a wire.
Can you hear me? Okay. So, before we go to the second part of the presentations, do you have any questions from your walkthrough from the tour? No questions. The building is very clear to everybody at the site. Okay. 2 minutes. Okay. The presentation is on its way from downstairs. I apologize.
Hopefully they don't turn.
George, have you worked on a train station before?
That's what I decided.
I might ask you some kind of question. So have you ever worked on a train station before? Have you ever worked on a train station before? I'm asking you a question.
Actually, I can.
Use the microphone. You worked on a train station?
My first major train station was about 20 years ago in Philadelphia. You may know the place. It's called the Reading Terminal Train Shed. It's in the heart of the city, and it is a similar project as this one, meaning it's an adaptive reuse. The train station was in the heart of the city, a block away from City Hall, and it was the collector of all the suburban lines from all the suburbs of Philadelphia. And it is an unusual train station because it was actually a big shed in which all of the trains would come in, and then people would take the metro, the subway, the buses, and go to other parts of the city. And in 1983, the city and the Pennsylvania Railroad Company and the Reading Railroad Company that operated the shed reached an agreement, and they gave up the station, the space altogether. And what they chose to do is connect the train station to a new project. It became the front door and meeting space for the Pennsylvania Convention Center in the city. The challenge of the project was that in addition to doing a fairly complex restoration, right below the platforms was the Reading Terminal Market. It was a farmer's market that had been in that location from 1898 up until the day of the project. And the requirement was to do the project while the market remains in place. So we did all sorts of gymnastics and so on. And at the end of the day, it was a very successful project. 24 years later, the market is still thriving. The train shed itself is viewed by many as the living room of the city because it has a major ballroom, a series of meeting rooms, and every major convention that is in Philadelphia is using that space to stage all of the major events. So that was my first train station. Thank you. One of the major questions that came up today had to do with the site and what is the complexity of the site. And I'm not sure if you all had the opportunity to walk through the entire building and go to Dalton Street. Did you all do that?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to try to put a couple of things in perspective here. If you draw an imaginary line where we stand today, this level, the rotunda level, the building is essentially split into two pieces. All of the historic spaces, all of the difficult spaces are above this line. All of the easy spaces are below this slab, and it's where all the galleries are. What does it mean in practical terms? All the big bay areas, the big spans, the spaces where we want to have our galleries, the exhibits, the conservation areas and so on, are below our feet, and we have the maximum flexibility to do anything we want in terms of systems. If we had designed the building today, I'm not sure if we'd done something different in terms of the structural system, because you have high floors, large spans, and the ability to put big areas with exhibits in contiguous spaces. Also, you have the ability to run your systems, heating, cooling, air conditioning, and so on throughout the entire thing. So, what is that organization when you look at it in plan? Our building is this. And it stops here at Dalton Street. So if you think about it, is this entire gigantic area, 2 floors that have essentially all the museums. And the edge of the property is Dalton Street. And if you look at it carefully, this fabulous fountain is partly on top of the building, and the edge of it is above Dalton Street. So when we look at the box of the building, it is this entire thing with the edge of Dalton Street. So what happens in the rest of it? When the building was designed originally, you had, in addition to the drives that used to bring the cars inside the building and under the rotunda, imagine right next to us, we have the ramps. The cars will come under, drop people off, and then come up again and out. And we had the cars, the buses, and the light rail. These retaining walls that we have all the way to Western Avenue were literally created because when you come out here and you follow the light rail, it will come all the way out to the edge of the property and into the street. And these retaining walls were holding the site in place, because this part is essentially a fill. And this part is a box on grade. So, in simple terms, we have a building that has a masonry envelope, and on this side of the box, it was completely open. It was open because it was garages, gas stations, baggage area, and so on. So now, when the renovation took place in 1990, 89, 90, this box was closed there with a new wall to contain the floors and create what we needed. What makes the museum work as a museum with all the amenities that it needs is that it has this phenomenal site that today is 2 very large parking lots, and we can accommodate all the patrons, park right here, and be able to come into the building very easily. So, the second set of questions people ask me is about the building envelope. And I do believe today, with the experience we had from the non-destructive examination program that we did in 2006 to 2007, and the repairs that we did for the first project, we understand the building envelope very well, and we can put an actual price tag as to what needs to be done to do the exterior repairs, the roofing, and anything that needs to be done to protect the investment, meaning the box that contains all the exhibits, the spaces, and so on. And it is fairly straightforward, it's not complex, it doesn't have any major challenge, and so on. Now, a lot of people asked an interesting question as we're walking through. It is a historic building, and do we have a lot of historic spaces with very expensive finishes, decoration, and so on and so forth? If you look at actual areas, the ratio of historic versus non-historic areas is rather unusual for a historic building of this size. I would say probably 20% of the floor area has high-end finishes. The rest is primarily boxes, which is unusual because the vast majority of the spaces are below our floor, and it's essentially steel spaces, steel structure, open, and we can do anything we want in terms of galleries, exhibits, and so on and so forth. So, as a ratio says, yes, I do have a strong image, I do have an iconic building, I do have spectacular spaces, but I do have also a great amount of flexibility to do anything I need to do as a museum. We did this first project to understand a couple of additional things in addition to the envelope. And the most important thing that we want to find out is, how does the interior space relate to the exterior skin, and how can we do this work when the building is occupied? Is it possible, or do we need to get people out of the building altogether? And we learn a lot about how the interior skin and the exterior skin come together. And going back to the initial statement that I made about relationship between historic and non-historic space, with the exception of what we see here on the south end and the director's office on the north end and a couple of additional spaces, the only other major historic space is the rotunda itself. So we don't have, as a percentage of the entire floor area, too many historic spaces and large volume. From the museum point of view, it is an advantage because it gives you the ability in the future to rethink your layout, where you're going to put your galleries, what you need to do, and so on. And you have a fairly flexible building because it was designed to be essentially an open space. During our walkthrough, the next question that was asked, which was very interesting, is why are the building systems arranged and placed in the locations where they are? And Art gave a very interesting explanation because he knows part of the project that I was not aware of. Art, would you like to join me?
Looking at the past and thinking about this building and putting, at that time, two museums, two separate museums and an Omnimax theater, the whole idea was, let's see, first of all, if this is going to work as a museum in this building. And the idea was, let's try to cut some costs in a way of placing central mechanical systems with these three components. So So you see fairly large, and this is, they're now 25 years old, fairly large air handlers that were developed in a way to cordon off certain areas, potentially. For instance, we have one air handler unit that is working the Omnimax Theater, the auditorium, and you have office spaces within the building supporting that. So when you really start to look at a building in the long term, you try to really cut down the numbers or actually increase the numbers of air handling units or generators for areas that are different. When you are trying to play the game of really consolidating, it becomes an operational cost that's extensive. It's a little simpler to put in, but in the long run, isn't really the way that you would approach a museum building like this. So, in essence, we created the 3 spaces. Now we have 4. So we had to borrow from one and borrow from another to try to create the Children's Museum when it came back in the mid-90s. To continue to do that, I think the cost will become extensive. So really looking at this point, because everything's at a point where it's at the end of its life, let's make the decision now, if it's going to be for the long term, to do this in a more focused way for those mechanical systems. Those are the answers we had given in the tour.
So, we're facing a challenge today that is at 3 different levels, parallel levels. Number one is we have a structure in the museum that was conceived 25 years ago, when the museums were consolidated into one space, and the systems were essentially lumped together to support these 3 areas. That's number one. Number two, which is a very important part of the discussion, is in 1990, 24 years ago, a number of existing systems, when it was a mall, the building, as some of you remember, were left in place. They were not replaced. There were some supplemental systems that were installed. And we're looking at ages of systems that range between 40 and 25 years of age. What does it mean in practical terms? If I'm a mechanical engineer and I open the manual of the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Engineers, and I look at the life expectancies of the different components, they range from 20 to 30 years. Technically, in many areas of the building, we have exceeded the life expectancies. We have systems that are very close to failing. And in some cases, over the course of the last 5 years or so, we have replaced units because there is the risk of shutting down parts of the building. So something needs to happen in the future very quickly and figure out what the HVAC vision and approach should be for the next 30 years. Regardless of whether the museum is in this location or goes somewhere else, an HVAC system needs to be in place for the entirety of the museum. And the museum is 500,000 square feet, 500,000 square feet. So that is something that needs to take place because it needs to be there to protect collections, conservation, rare manuscripts, exhibits, traveling exhibits, and so on and so forth. So, if you think about what happens in the future in this building, there are some efficiencies that can be achieved if you organize the spaces a little bit better, and you put the systems in the right locations. And if you use new generation of equipment, you're going to have some energy efficiency as well in the performance of the systems. So let's make an assumption briefly and say, let's assume that the project happens and you move forward. By the time the project is completed, 4 or 5 years from now, some of the systems will be 30 years old. The risk is significant of having systems failing in the next 2 or 3 years that we're in today. So we need to deal with the envelope, we need to deal with the systems, we need to think about the organization of the museum. We also need to think about how we can perform the work and whether this project is something that can be done with the museum remaining in place, a portion of the museum shutting down, or is it logical or reasonable to expect that the museum can close for the duration of the project? And these are questions that we have to ask in every project we do. And why do we do this? We do it for a couple of reasons. Number one is we need to understand what is the penalty that a project pays when you do work in an occupied building. I'll give you a specific example. We are working right now on the New Jersey State House. It's the second oldest capital in the United States. And we're having discussions with the governor's office and the leadership to figure out what happens there. And their question was, can we stay where we are and not move, and you do the work while we're in the building? And we said, absolutely, we can do a study. We got experts, we brought on board construction managers and so on, and did peer review with us. And at the end of the day, we found that if we do the work while the building is fully occupied, the penalty will be between 30 and 35% on the project cost. That's a significant penalty. Then the question that came back was, okay, can we split the building half and half? Move half of the people out, do the construction while half of the building is empty, and then come back. We figure out that there are significant savings compared to the previous scenario, but the penalty was still there. And there are two dimensions that we need to think about. One is time, because time is money, and the other is what are the logistics we have to pay so that we can maintain occupancy in certain parts of the building. And that's an important part on any project we do. It's an existing building, an existing project, and we have to think about what it means. And some of our clients come to us and they ask us one simple question. Would it be easier to go to a new building altogether? The answer is not necessarily, because you have to think about whether you're going to get an equivalent space or not, and what it means in terms of your operations and so on and so forth. In most of the monumental buildings we're working on, historic buildings, the answer is probably you are not going to be able to do apples to apples comparison. For example, the building we're looking at here today has been in place for 80 years. If we do a proper renovation, we can extend the life of the building for another 80 years. If you say I can move an organization such as this one to a new building, the question is, are you going to be able to build a building, a timeless building that will be part of the community for the next generations or two, for a cost that you can afford? The answer is probably not. And it's something that is difficult to figure out. But it can be, this kind of question can be answered if you put the right parameters in place. So back to this assignment, our master plan and project one. What did we learn over the last 7, 8 years? Number one is that we can repair the envelope of the building quite well at a very reasonable cost compared to new construction. And we can have a life expectancy of the building envelope for anywhere between 50 and 80 years. Number two is we learned that we have a very good flexible space for a museum, and the experiment that took place in 1990, when all the museums came under one roof, is actually working quite well because you have a building that can accommodate the needs of the three institutions, and you can do a number of very creative things with the building and the space you have for the next 50, 80 years. Three, we learned that we have a unique site that can be a destination and can help the museum and the function of the museum by having people come, park, be in a good environment, and then go into the building. Four, I do believe that you have in this building and this institution and a brand, an image, an icon that you cannot find anywhere else in the world. The thing that I personally like the most about the way the building works as a building is you can accommodate very large numbers of people very easily without having to go through gymnastics and difficult configurations and so on. A space such as the Rotunda is very difficult to find in any museum, and it's a place where you can actually get your audience in, help them figure out where they need to go in terms of the three museums, and have experiences that are truly memorable. So, in our opinion, this is a very interesting place, and if we compare the construction costs to what we're finding in this building to other similar construction projects throughout the United States, we do believe that it's actually very reasonable. And it is a good investment that can give you 50, 80 years easily if we do this right, with one caveat. And the caveat is very simple that you can see every day around you. From 1975 roughly until today, the building has had pretty much zero maintenance. It had only crisis management, from one crisis to the next. When we all go out and buy a new car, we get a manual, an owner's manual, and we maintain the car. We don't do crisis management or maintenance of the car. The car is going to break down. Unfortunately, we don't do this with buildings, especially older ones. And the reason why we don't do this with older ones is because older ones have some level of elasticity that is higher than newer construction, and they can absorb more punishment. And unfortunately, we take advantage of that. So if you look at what has happened in the last 45 years or so in the life of Union Terminal, we had what we call deferred maintenance. I would say we're neglecting it. And you don't do that with buildings that are cultural facilities and so on. Any new building that we build, we have the obligation to maintain properly. So we believe as a design team that the building has a potential. The costs are within a specific range and they're fairly reasonable. If we maintain it properly, it can be a long-term asset. And I don't believe it's easy to replace spaces that exist in this building easily with new construction without spending actually more money than the renovation itself. Questions?
As you go through this work, George, are you able to, a question that came up on our tours, are you able to separate the work that needs to be done for maintenance, preservation, well, maintenance, versus the work that needs to be done for historical preservation?
That's an interesting, very interesting question. Okay. We get this kind of question quite often from clients and say, do I pay a penalty because the building is historic? Is there a premium I pay for that? Well, let's look at this building specifically. The building envelope, the box itself, was built with specific construction methods and materials and assemblies that were designed in the 1920s. They were put in place in 1930. And if you look at what happened over time, we don't have anything exotic or anything unusual. It is bricks on the back of the building and limestone on the front. That are cladding steel construction, things that we would use today. So if we do the repairs of the building correctly, and we put the right details back in place, we will have a building that will last a long time, again, with the right maintenance. What is the right maintenance? Is there a difference between the maintenance of a historic building versus a non-historic building? The answer is there isn't. Simple things. In every building, on a regular basis, I have to go back onto the roof and make sure that my drains work. If I don't, they're going to clog. Water is going to find a way through the pipes into the building itself. I'm going to have problems. So they're basic tasks that need to be done on a regular basis. Are there any extraordinary areas where I need to spend money because they're historic? There are 3 in this building. It's the south zone, the dining rooms and so on. It is the north zone, and it's the rotunda. And as I said earlier, as a percentage of the building, it's a relatively small percentage. Okay, let's talk about the rotunda. In the 80 years of history of the rotunda, it has been painted twice. Maybe we need to do a 3rd time. That's a remarkable statistic. If you think about other buildings, we probably paint the common areas and the public areas and lobbies and so on every 10 years. So, to me, that is a significant difference. Now, will it be expensive to paint it? Yes. But if I do it every 40 years or 50 years, then you can amortize the cost and you can figure out what it means. Can I have a space such as the rotunda easily? The answer, I cannot build it today. It will be prohibitively expensive to build it. Now, is it a useful space? This is a question that has been asked by others. And in my opinion, this space can hold the keys to the future of the museum. This can be a space that can generate income. It has one drawback. The drawback is the acoustics. And we need to figure out how we can mitigate the reverberation time that you have in the rotunda so you can have events. People want to use the space. We found over the course of the last 7-8 years that there is a keen interest in using the space if, and only if, we figure out through acoustical means of enhancing speech. It is the perfect place to have an organ recital. But it's not the perfect space to have the President of the United States address an audience. So if we can figure it out, we have a wonderful space and a wonderful opportunity. So can it be done? The answer is yes. And you know, part of the team is we have brought on board Arup, which is a world-leading entity that does acoustics all over the world. And we're now trying to figure out what that means, both in terms of cost and in terms of the intervention. So to your point, if I will be looking at, for example, the National Gallery of Art, the ratio of historic versus non-historic space is completely different, it's the opposite. At the National Gallery of Art, we have 80% historic spaces, 20% non-historic. Here we have 20% historic and 80% non-historic. So I don't think that in a project such as this one, we pay a severe penalty. And the follow-up is, I don't believe that the maintenance is more difficult or more expensive. Now, we don't have to worry about things that were the problem in the past. We don't smoke in the building anymore. We don't have pollutants. We don't have the other things that happened in the past. So the building can maintain itself a little bit better. But we do have to do our own homework. Other questions?
There is a question on the tour about how well the interior envelope will hold up when the exterior envelope's removed during construction.
That's an excellent question. What you're asking is, when I do this, what happens? This is the most severe case in the building, where we actually have the corner with the column being completely exposed. We remove the masonry, we do the repairs to the column, and then we put it back together. If you look at the building carefully, there are two layers of masonry. There is the exterior layer, which is the brick that you see, and behind it you have the backup. When we did the construction, in 99% of the cases, the interior masonry, the backup, remained in place. In a few areas we had to open it up so that we can anchor certain things. But in the vast majority of the spaces, we can do the work without breaching into the interior. That's point number one. Point number two is, if we need to breach into the interior, we always build an enclosure so that there is no communication between the exterior and the interior. I think the question can become a little more complex if we ask it differently. Can I be there when the construction takes place? Can I be in the space physically when the construction takes place? We actually had the same debate at the New Jersey State House. The client said, can we do that? And we said, we can, and here's what we did at the Supreme Court in DC. We had to replace all of the windows at the Supreme Court for a number of reasons. And what happened there is we built a construction barrier inside each room that was transparent to allow light to come in and do all the work outside that barrier. Expensive. In my view, if you look at the total, here's the advantage that you have in this building. Here's the restored steel. This aerial photograph will give us some idea of what I'm about to talk about. If you think about how much perimeter wall you have in relationship to the interior of the building, the edge of the building is very thin, and you can choose to have a construction zone of 2 to 3 feet, and 90% of the space is not impacted at all. Should you do that? I'm not sure if I would do it, and it has nothing to do with breaching the exterior or not. It has to do with the way you want to zone your building. And from the construction point of view, what I would do is I would organize vertical slices of the building. Roof, envelope, interior spaces, systems, and so on. And do the entire thing as a small building, top to bottom. Do everything there, then go to the next one, and so on. That's normally the way we would stage construction in a project such as this one. The key question that comes up then at that point is, how many of these slices? Well, more slices, more time, more cost. More stages of construction, more cost. So this project, the experts will tell us, the experts in construction, but I would speculate that it can be done in 2 slices. You can split the building literally in half, right in the middle, and do it in 2 slices. So to answer your question, we can do the exterior work, and if you think about it, the statement that I made about the horizontal separation of the building, historic spaces above the rotunda, non-historic spaces below the rotunda. So the majority of the spaces where we have to do the work are not critical spaces, meaning have fancy finishes, expensive interiors, and so on. They're boxes. So logistically, it can be done. Did I answer? Yes, sir.
George, can you explain, you said we can do this in 2 slices, vertical slices. Can you explain where you see that happen?
Just give me 1 second to find the plan. There we are. If you look at the building is really perfectly symmetrical. And in all of our projects, we say we have a very simple principle. Ask the building the right questions, and we'll give you the right answers. So if you think about it, you can literally draw a line in the middle of the building, and you can do north and south. Okay? Now, if you go through that carefully, you will find that your mechanical rooms are not stacked. And they're not in the right locations. So, what we normally do in projects such as this one is we find the locations of the new mechanical rooms first. We put them in place, and then we begin the construction sequence. So, if we do this correctly, you will find that we think that you do have the east-west axis. You have the north half and the south half. But the key question that we need to ask here is the following. Again, let's ask the building a simple question. When you stand in front of the building and you look at the building, you have this beautiful arch. And on either side, you have these towers framing it. And the original design scheme was very ingenious and very simple. And we like simplicity in design. If it's complicated, it's a problem. If it's simple, it can work to our advantage. These 2 areas is where the stair towers are. You walk through them. They're open to the sky. I can essentially do my outside air intakes at the top. They've been abandoned. You see some air handling units, some ductwork, some copper left in place, and so on. Great. I love that they abandoned all these things in place, because now I have the space. I can begin to construct my sequence of construction and putting my air handling units in those locations. And if you think about logically, you have 3 zones: the south zone, the middle zone, and the north zone. If I figure out a way to put in my major intakes in the towers and create 2 east-west spines where my distribution and my mechanical rooms are there, I can organize the building any way I want. So the slices may be 3. And the reason why you may want to think about 3 slices is because of the rotunda. But because you can flank the rotunda on both sides, you can go either way. Automatically, if you have the space there, you can buy yourself some flexibility, and you don't depend on where the existing air handling units are. Are we together? Yes, sir.
George, so today was my first day to tour the building. I haven't really seen the drawing, so this is an uninformed question. But the
It may be the best question.
I've heard a lot of discussion about new mechanical rooms, and in thinking about that, if we toured, we saw the boilers and the chillers, and to me, there's a cost to replace that equipment where it is. And if an air handler's bad, there's a cost to replace it where it is. When you talk about a new mechanical room, that tells me you're going to then revise all the ductwork, the piping, architectural modifications go with it. It seems like a lot more is involved.
Let's go you're going a little bit fast. Let's go one step at a time, okay? Because you ask a series of important questions. It's not one, okay? Let's go one step at a time. The existing equipment, one way or another, will have to be replaced. Air handlers, boilers, chillers, all that needs to be replaced. They have reached and exceeded their useful lives. That's number one, in our opinion. I want to hear the experts and our colleagues in the dialogue tomorrow. But in our view, no matter how we slice it, we're way beyond the 40 years that is the life expectancy of these things. That's the first question. Second question is, if I put them back in the same location, and I do what is known as a replacement in kind, do I have at the end of the day a good layout and a good architectural and mechanical system? The answer is probably not, and here's why. Art said to us that the way we shoved in the original museums in the building was based on the assumption that they're different and separate institutions, not one. That's no longer the case. I can now have galleries and exhibits that can be shared, can be used by the 3 institutions, can have flexibility, can do a number of things. That's the way we design a museum today. Third, in the floors below us, I have no issues running ducts or anything else any way I want. If I organize the building correctly, I would probably have to redo some of my ducts. How many? I don't know. The central spines should be fine, where I'm removing the volume of air. But my question to everybody around the table would be, should we have the cost of, pick a number, 2,000 feet of duct drive the next 30 years of the institution or not? Because if we have a bad layout, and Art indicated that the layout is not great the way it is, are we going to make an investment for the next 30 years to have a mediocre layout because we're going to save $1 million in sheet metal? The experts will tell us. That's part of the debate that we're going to have. But the more I get into it and I analyze it, My question is it really savings? Or is it spending less money but giving up options for the future, flexibility, functionality, and so on and so forth? And then, if you go back to the history of the building, similar things happened 30 years ago. When you all were doing the 1990 renovation, a decision was made, okay, now we're about to have an experiment. Let's see if the experiment works. I think that everybody around the table would agree that the experiment works great. This is one of the most visited museums in the country. It's one of the most popular attractions in this region. It has an incredibly successful mission. Okay, so how can we enable the museum as an organization to function even better? Are we going to help the museum to function even better if we say, no, you're going to work on the basis of the old floor plan, because we can save some money on sheet metal or 2 mechanical rooms. I'm not the expert in that, but my logic says, if I'm going to plan something for the next 30, 50 years, I better put the mechanical rooms in the right locations for today and for the next 50 years. Today, we can predict and plan the layout of the floors below us in such a way so that over the next 30 years and 50 years, we can figure out all sorts of things we can do. On the other hand, if we lock them into specific locations, the floor plate is what it is. So, that would be my reaction. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, so I think what would be helpful is to just understand what would be the cost of replacing equipment so the systems would continue to function as they are today versus a whole new mechanical system, which I think is going to be a lot more costly. But maybe not, but at least to understand what
the difference between in-kind replacement, essentially, and total replacement.
Yes.
Okay. That's essentially what you're asking the process to produce. Okay. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. No questions?
Got another one for you, George, that was asked during the tour. We all know that this project improves and adds to the longevity of the building. What are some of the aspects of the improved programming of the museum that are going to occur because of this project?
I'm not the expert to answer this, but as an architect that has done similar projects, I'm going to say 2 things, and then I will ask Doug to step in. From the architectural point of view, if I would be doing the project today from scratch, based on the evidence of the last 25 years, meaning the experiment is successful. I have visitation, I have people, I have excitement, I have loyalty, I have an audience. What I need to do is I want to make sure that what happens in all of the spaces where I have programs, exhibits, activities, I can give the maximum flexibility that I need, because as you know, when we do museums today, the way we design experiences today are going to be completely different 10 years from now. 20 years ago, most of the exhibits were static. Today, 99% of the exhibits are interactive. So, it's no different than designing a lab. We have clients who come to our firm and say, please design a lab for me that I can reconfigure for the next experiment. So what we do is we create a bay and we move systems around. So in terms of the discussion we started 10 minutes earlier about the HVAC system, is if I can have the ability to have modules and runs of ducts and the flexibility to move walls and reconfigure spaces, I have given to the institution the flexibility to figure out the experiences in the future in a number of different ways. The static part of the building is on this floor. And this building, this floor it is what it is. We're not going to move walls around or anything else. The future of the museum, in my opinion, is below our feet.
I would, when you turn this to Tom Owens from PGAV Destinations, that would really be a perfect question for him. Scott, can we frame it for Tom, if you could answer that. So Tom Owens is with PGAV Destinations. So maybe if, Scott, if you want to reframe the question for Tom, but this firm does international work in theme parks, museums, things like that. They did the Atlanta Aquarium. And so they're working with us in terms, and they did the Kennedy Space Center. They do SeaWorld. So they've done lots of projects, and it's around how do you attract public today to come to specific destinations, which I think is kind of what you're framing it.
Okay, so maybe I'll combine a couple questions here then. When everyone was taking the tour today, one of their big comments was, you know, the public doesn't know about this. The public doesn't know about what's going on behind these walls. When the public comes in, and they're going to hear that this is X amount of renovation on this project, when they come back to this museum, they're going to walk in and expect a better experience, or at least expect to understand what went on behind the scenes. So how are we going to inform the public, number one, and number two, what's some of the programming that's going to improve from the museum as the museum moves forward from this project?
That's a great question. In fact, I think as we walked around today, and I even learned more about some of the plans for what it's going to take to do everything we're talking about today, it made me think about ways that we can help tell that story. So to your point about telling the story about what has been done, I think there's a great Science Center story to be told in that as well. Just what it took to what happens to a building and what it takes to restore and stabilize a building. In terms of the guest experiences, I think when people walk in the front door, in some ways, if it's going to look, sort of like when you walk in, it's going to look the way it should. And so will you get credit for having made all the improvements and all the changes? So I think that there have to be improvements from the moment you walk in the front door. And I think we are involved with working with the museum team here to improve spaces like this, looking at how can we do a better job of food service, of retail, of guest services, of ticketing, of making the rotunda the best possible space it can be for catering and special events, and as an asset to the community. That term was used earlier. So we will be considering those things in our planning, which is ongoing now, and to really enhance this and bring it up to its full potential as a guest experience ideal. Leveraging the iconic power of the building exterior and the interior of this rotunda and these fabulous spaces like the ones we're in today. We're looking at how to make those the most powerful assets to the whole that really leverage their unique nature, the authenticity, which we know from a lot of experience and a lot of visitor research is extremely powerful in attracting people. They look for authentic experiences, but also the expectation that the amenities are the most modern and current and up to date. The technology is there. So we think that we want to work within this wonderful framework, but enhance these all of these sort of guest experience amenities as much as possible. Now that's in the sort of the common areas, the rotunda and these adjoining spaces. In addition to that, we're going to be looking at enhancements to the exhibits so that the whole visitor experience through the exhibit side is enhanced as well. There will be dramatically different kinds of things, and exactly, George, as you were saying, that very different from what would have been done originally in the past, and this will carry things out quite a bit into the future. So, did that answer the question?
Tom, can you give an example from some other project you worked on of how an exhibit is, George mentioned passive to interactive. That's one example of, I don't know that that's critical for the renovation and construction. But give an example of another project that you worked on where you improved the quality of the visitor experience. And give us a specific example of what the experience was and what it will be. Or what it was and what it will be.
The mention of our work at Kennedy Space Center, we had the privilege of designing a museum on the campus of Kennedy Space Center to celebrate the history of the space shuttle programming, and included housing these retired space shuttle Atlantis. And so, in the past, that would have primarily been done as a passive thing. In fact, the way that the Smithsonian is doing it is they basically, they have Discovery, they pulled theirs into the hangar and parked it and have a few graphic panels around it, and that's essentially what they've done. We took a different approach at Kennedy Space Center, and so we have located Atlantis about 20 feet up in the air and banked as if it's in flight, at work, we called it. And so with the payload bay doors open, as if it was on orbit, and there was a whole storyline that drove this, and so we positioned it as if it had just moved away from the International Space Station, and we staged everything, including the position of the arm, and then surrounded that with interactive exhibits, like an interactive multi-user, 20-foot long interactive timeline that people can learn about the history of the space shuttle. There was there is a very dramatic theater where your first impression of Atlantis comes through a very dramatic reveal, and on like that, where there's nothing passive about it. Even the way that you view Atlantis is done with a very dramatic approach, as you always see it from a different frame of reference. The lighting, those kinds of things change. So we wrote custom score and music for it. There's many interactive exhibits, over 60 interactive exhibits just for this one piece. So it's just an example of the whole building is kind of a living building. And it's a very different kind of experience than what they have at Kennedy Space Center, or what you currently have in this building today. That's much more the standard that we would have going forward into the new kinds of experiences we can have. Even things like ways to come in and see these murals and perhaps have an opportunity for digital interaction to be able to drill in. And these murals have such an equity in the community. For people to be able to really go into them digitally and learn about them, stand in the rotunda space and to explore those that way. So many things like that we can do that would take this from a passive experience to a highly interactive one.
If I may, I would like to add a couple of more things. Your statement triggered a couple of things in my mind. If you think about what we just said about the 2 floors below us and the kinds of spaces you want to create for exhibits, think of the ceiling of the exhibit space and the floor of the exhibit space as 2 continuous feeds of infrastructure, lighting, power, air, and so on, that will allow you to position exhibits in that space in any way you want. Right now, you don't have that ability. Right now, what you have is the ducts, the air, and everything are for a specific location, for a specific exhibit that was designed 25 years ago, and it was parked in that location. Your term, parking the Atlantis, triggered that. Some of the exhibits here were designed and placed in place 24, 25 years ago. If we are to do the HVAC system based solely on these exhibits, We've given up the flexibility for the future completely. Thank you for triggering that. Scott, did we answer your question? Now, one more thing I would like to talk about regarding systems in the building. I'm in agreement with all of the people who are concerned about the cost of the mechanical system because, practically speaking, it is the largest offender, quote unquote, in the budget of a project. It represents one of the largest line items in the overall budget. Number one. Number two, it is also the item that can make or break an experience in an exhibit space. Because it's environmental comfort, it has to do with exhibits, it has to do with bringing exhibits from other museums, meeting museum standards, international conventions, and so on and so forth. If the system is not designed to meet the requirements and specifications of 2015 going forward, then the options of the museum become more limited. The other thing that we need to think about is that in 2014, lighting has changed completely. When we started projects 10 years ago, LED was just getting into the market. Now LED is the standard. For example, in the spaces we did in Project 1, Adam reminded me there were 0 incandescent lamps. All LEDs, compact fluorescents, and so on. That in itself is a major change that changes the quality of lighting, the quality of the experience, energy conservation, cost of running the building. So all of these factors need to be thought through in terms of what is the infrastructure that is going to be feeding the museum. Whether it's going to be in this location or any other location, the same standards and criteria should be applied. Because when you're making investment for the next 30 years, it is about the performance of the space for the next 30 years. Other questions? I have a question for all of you. And the question is this: what is the single thing that you saw today in our walkthrough that you would like the rest of us to know about because it's significant, it's a concern, and so on? We're going to spend the next day or so as a group to try to figure out what should be included in the show. And you asked a specific question. And I think it's a legitimate question. We need to address it straight on. What were the other things that... Thank you. What were the other things that you saw today that we should be aware of in our thinking? Is there something that we should be concerned about? Yes, sir.
Yeah, nothing surprised me in terms of the physical condition of the space. It's an old space. What was very difficult to understand, and maybe work has been done on this, is how the program fits the building. And I can understand how you have big spaces below this floor, but it's confusing, you know, when you go through storage areas and ramp areas, etc., to understand how usable those spaces are and how that fits the program. That's what I found difficult.
Thank you for asking the question. I think you may have asked 3 questions. Okay, and let me rephrase it first so we can address it, and please correct me. If I'm not mistaken, you went through a series of spaces in a fashion that normally the visitor does not go through. So you went from an exhibit space through secure doors to a storage area, Then you went to the dirt floor area, the unfinished part and so on. And you saw storage, you saw conservation, you saw staging, you saw exhibits. And your question is, how do all these things relate? Right? That's question number one. The second question I think you asked was, are we using the building efficiently? Okay? Am I capturing correctly? Okay. I'm going to connect your dot to Art's dot, who said, when we moved in here, we tried to put the potatoes we had in separate bags, regardless of how they were related to each other. We had 3 museums, 1 box. And each museum had a certain level of autonomy and separation. Part of the confusion today has to do with that fact that happened 24 years ago. Today, the Cincinnati Museum Center is one institution, even though there are 3 collections under one roof, but it's one institution, and it should and can be one experience. To do that, we have to undo some of the walls and the separation and the circulation. Full stop. I'm going to connect your dot again to your dot. When we put in when Art put in the HVAC system with his team 20-some years ago, they had to do something that was literally desperation time. We need to open the building, we need to put everybody in this room, in this box. And he would borrow some air from a gallery space to the conservation area, and some air from the office to the next area, and so on. The fact of the matter is that we have different zones in the building, and each one requires different environmental conditions. An office does not need humidity control. An artifact storage and a gallery, they do. But if I share air from one air handling unit to 2 or 3 zones because I had to do this 24 years ago, I have a bad layout. To repeat it again in terms of continuing in-kind replacement, it's a problem. So to your point, when I connect your dot, I have a layout that's not terribly logical. And unless I have an incredible sense of orientation when I'm down in the basement, I can find myself lost. So part of what needs to happen in any museum, whether it's in this space or in a different space, is to have a logic that the visitor can follow and say, I get it now. I can go here, I can go there. So if we connect these 2 dots, a lot of things should be on the table to consider. Okay? Now, the other thing that we need to think about is efficiency of use. Again, the museum moved in, the museums, plural, and they used the space. And it was survival mode. We need to open tomorrow. We have everybody here. And I don't know if you all remember, the original numbers for the project were vastly different than what happened at the end of 1990. And everybody said, all right, we're going to cut the budget. At that moment, the project, the institutions, the experiment gave up a lot of things. And the compromise that took place at that point was serious. Okay, is it time to think about them now or not? Because today we're living, as an organization, we live with the decisions that were made in 1990. Are these decisions the right decisions today? I'm not the person to answer that question. The community is. This task force needs to say, we want to go left, we don't want to go right. But you asked a very important question, and the question in my mind says, when you think about the 2 floors below us, give me clarity, give me good organization, And indirectly you said, give me very good experience. Because if we spend money, I want to have a very good experience, because that's what everybody's seeking in the museum. Other questions?
Is it impossible to understand floor plans? Because we could put a map up to show you floor plans. Because I think that, Mark, I think what you're talking about, I think that the way we took you through the building is an impossible way to understand the building. And that's what you're saying. Yeah. We can pop that on the screen if you like. It'll show you what that. Here's what they got right here.
Okay.
While he's doing that, could you help me with something? So you mentioned the term 500,000 square feet. Is that exhibit space? Okay. If you were building a new building, how many square feet would you build to replace what we have here?
That's a very tricky question. And it is a very tricky question for the following reason. You have some spaces here that are here. For example, would you build the railroad director's office? I don't think so. But would you want to have a great lobby? Yes. Should it be the same as the rotunda? I would answer it by saying it needs to be a memorable experience. Any and every museum in the world creates the memorable experience at the front door. You have it now, it's in place. So if we think about it, I don't think you can get away with anything below 450,000 square feet. Yeah. Now, the other thing that you need to remember is when you build an institution today, you don't build it for the program of today. You never do that. You build it for the next 30 years. Do you want to have some growth? Is this the right real estate to do the growth? We always ask our clients simple things. Should, for example, storage be in the prime real estate or be off-site? Okay? But if you look at how many balls they're juggling up in the air here, I don't think they're using the space inefficiently or anything else. So to answer your question, I wouldn't entertain anything below $500,000 because you're giving up your future.
So I think here's what you're talking about that was confusing. So we were, back here's the mechanical rooms, we were sort of outside the building. And we walked out here, we went down the hallway. And that's all mechanical rooms there. We went down that hallway, we came around here, we came into these shops. And then we came back down, we came around the loading docks are back in here, we came into this storage area here. We came around here, we came into this storage area. This is the dark storage, it had the dirt floor. We came down here, then we came out that door, came over here, went in that door, and then we went through that storage and came around like this to the back side of the building.
So Doug, maybe you can explain from the perspective of the visitor.
So the visitor never hits these. So we talk about reusing spaces. So this is all Natural History Museum. Now, the weird thing in the building is it's ramps going down. So the floors aren't even. So this is the lowest floor, which actually where most of the exhibits are. So this is all natural history, okay? And then here's the Children's Museum. You don't realize it, they're like next to each other, okay? This is the big changing exhibit hall. This is the smaller changing exhibit hall. This is the really large one. So this has the really tall ceilings, has loading docks on both sides, and we talked about that was critical. And then this is the public landing, which we didn't even walk through. This space here is the space we've turned into the Duke Energy train exhibit. So that's in that area there. And that had the Christmas stuff in, we walked around the edge. So this is History Museum here. This is Natural History here. This is Children's Museum. Now the History Museum on this side, the Natural History on this side, they go up. So the next 2 levels up are continuation of those exhibits. So the Children's Museum is just on that bottom level. When we talk about expanding, where's the capacity to expand? So this is that big mechanical room that you could use for something, and this is storage that you could repurpose in this storage space here. So that's where you have expansion capacity in the future for doing other things inside the building envelope that just gives you flexibility down the road. And the more of this, and anything on this ground floor is prime real estate. I mean, that's your best space you have for doing museum exhibits. Museum exhibits do well in totally dark black boxes for doing things. So we don't necessarily want light and windows and all those sorts of things for those exhibits. So does that give you the context, sort of? I can take you up a floor, but I think basically you go up the next floor and you're just gonna, it's basically gonna split like that. It's gonna be natural history, and then history is gonna be this section here. But yeah, I realized you said that. That's, yeah, we gave you a confusing route.
Are you going to go to another floor?
So it's the next floor up, and so what you've got here is, so the big changing exhibit hall is a 2-story space. So you've got no use of that space, and these white spaces here are basically kind of where the ramp systems create the effect of eliminating any usable space on that level. So, so then these are, so this is where the cave area is, right in here. These are natural history exhibits. If you walk through, these are history exhibits in this space, and then we've got classrooms that go all the way across here on that end. This is where the dividing line was between the Historical Society and the Natural History Museum. So, I mean, those are like hard firewall doors, and everything was penetrated. The staff will laugh about the fact that they literally never opened those doors between the 2 institutions. It's like a different place. And then back here, which we didn't go through today, that's where the library is. Historical Society Library is back here. And this is collection storage, and that's actually on 2 levels, up and down. And this is collection storage and artifact manuscripts back in that space. And those are level kind of office types floors that are, 9-10 foot ceilings, but more conventional. And I'm going to take you up. Okay, so this is, again, because of the way the ramp system works. But this is the beginning of the Natural History Museum exhibits going down. This is where the Cincinnati in Motion exhibits are, is in that area there, where the model city of Cincinnati. And the Cincinnati Goes to War is here in those spaces. And those are like, okay, yeah, then, okay, this is the concourse level. It's showing it going down half floor. So this is the concourse level, so there's your rotunda. Here's where we are, Cincinnati Dining Room. There's the IMAX Theater, which is, that's where the building is to go straight on back. And the IMAX Theater is basically the infill for what was the end of the building in terms of how they filled that space out. That's an auditorium. We didn't go back here. These were the Union Terminal corporate, the chairman of the board's offices. are back here, and we didn't, our group, we cut that off, because that would get pretty long. That's retail, of that space. So now you're going up another level, so everything's, so now you're only picking up extra levels for these office areas, these quadrants back here. So, and I won't really go through it, but it's the same for the first, well, yeah. So this area here is a large office section, as is over here. That was sort of the finance office room. Those were the historic dining rooms we were in there. So that's on the first floor. And this is the next floor up, so this we walked down those funny hallways, and you saw those two-story rooms were on each side here, so that's basically all there. There's a few offices on each side there. That's our youth programs offices, the exhibits there. And then this is the top level, or in that quadrant. So then this is offices here. We were looked at these offices here. That's where the windows were real bad, and that were never replaced. So those offices there. That's where you saw the real bad mold coming around. Because now we're up above the parapet wall. And this is basically when you get up and you see Tower A. So now you've gone from top to bottom. Yep.
I have a question.
Hmm?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you share with us where you would potentially place the science center within the building?
Well, you know, I mean, I think the Science Center's down the road. It's certainly not a part of the project that we're talking about here. But you know, I think doing any kinds of new exhibits, Science Center, other kinds of things, the Science Center would be to redo the entire Science Museum from end to end. So it would be all those spaces, and you'd have the capacity of expanding on that lowest level. But I showed you those lower levels, like the dark storage. Those are tall ceilings, so you could expand in that space. Yes, it's the one space that's tall enough that you can do full-scale dinosaur mounts, things like that, that you could actually put in that space down there. What you kind of put in space is kind of dictated by what the environment, what the height restrictions are.
I had a question. Several times they've discussed moving mechanical systems. Where would you move those mechanical systems?
Your question is, where would you put mechanical systems?
Yes.
Okay. Can we go to the rotunda floor, please? Actually, stop there, thank you. If you look at, for the mechanical systems, you want to make sure that you have 3 or 4 things in place when you make your decision. Number one is where you're going to take your outside air from. And the outside air in a museum needs to come normally from the top of the building. And the best way to bring in the outside air is from these 2 towers. And these 2 towers give you continuity all the way to the basement. Okay? Now, let's think about this line here and this line here. I have also these 2 light wells in place. And if I draw 2 imaginary lines, one here and one here, I can take my building and do it in 3 zones. Somewhere along this line here, and along this line here, I can create boxes where I put my mechanical equipment, bring in the outside air. I have enough space. If you don't mind, okay. If we don't mind going back to what I had there before. Fine, that's fine, that's fine. These spaces here are large enough and stacked that will give us the ability to condition spaces that are to the south or to the north. Okay? If you go to the ramps, you will see that the ramps have no air conditioning with forced air, and so they have units that are directly mounted to the roof. So if you want to do this correctly, you need to find a location. And in the master plan, in the first project, we did a diagram and we figure out that in these 2 areas, you can stack enough units to do quite a few things with the ramps, and the areas here and here. Okay? So if you follow the diagram here, and this line there, you can park in locations, that's part of the design, your handling units, and then you can feed north and south off of that line. The advantages are several. If you do that, you don't have major runs for your outside air, and then you can split north and south without having huge runs either. In other words, the economy of the sheet metal is going to be tremendous. Okay? By not having multiple remote locations, you also can control the size of your units. Okay? And if you have them in similar locations, you can use them for redundancy. Meaning, if I can stack 3 units, and I need only 2, I have a third for redundancy and spare capacity at peak loads and all that. Are we together? Does it make sense to you?
Does that still eliminate the AC warm A and B for all? In this scenario, that eliminates the mechanical spaces down?
In theory, yes, that's the way. But we haven't done the design yet. This is master plan.
Understood.
Yeah.
Make sure we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into budget discussions later on as we get into the week and next week. In general, that we've heard numbers in the low hundreds of millions of dollars, 120, 150, different ranges. In very general terms, what percentage of that is construction cost to fix the building and keep it going for the next 80 or 100 years, and what percentage of that is programmatic changes, programmatic enhancements?
What do you mean by programmatic enhancements?
So the public would see and have that kind of awe feeling when they walk in the door and see what they spent their tax dollars on.
The public will see 3 things right off the bat when they come in. Number 1 is the building will be brighter and cleaner. You will have, the exterior will be clean, stone will be repaired, the glass will be clean, the entrance will be redone. We're going to have the right lighting. Lighting is going to be completely different, which is a major part of the experience. Right now, your lighting in some areas is completely unacceptable and dim, in my opinion. And you need to have the ability to control your light and create different settings, which you don't have today. Every museum will do that. Public spaces and so on. So that these 2 things, it's something that the public is going to see immediately. The public is going to see something that is going to experience something that they don't know that exists, but they can have. If you have galleries and exhibit space that can handle any exhibit, the museum will have 0 limitations to bring in any exhibit from anywhere in the world. Today, there are limits. It's no different than designing, let's say, a convention center. The conventions you bring into town relate to what you can handle. The box that we have today has two limitations. One is it doesn't have the HVAC you need, and number two, it is configured in ways that really don't make a whole lot of sense. We change these two things, the public will see immediately a difference because the experience will change from day one. We bring in different shows, better experience and so on. So these three things can happen immediately. And you can be on the same level with other museums that are aspiring to have certain goals and certain aspirations. The problem we have, and I think you're asking an interesting question if we flip it slightly. It's something we discussed earlier in the presentation. The problem is the building is already very photogenic. We photograph it, looks great. Is the difference this much, or this much, or this much when we spend all this money? And how quickly can we see that? In my opinion, when the building is restored and done correctly, the moment you walk in, you will sense the difference immediately. And as you come up, you will see the difference. I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, you did. Tim alluded to it. This question was asking more that the Science Center would be, some of us have heard tidbits about, where I think we've got some great opportunities because of our connection to different science things, Neil Armstrong things. It just feels to me like if you're in the general public and you're going to vote to fund a significant expense like this, that the things that you're mentioning, which are terrific and are great, may not give that shock and awe feeling that when you walk in the door you think, oh, this is what I spent my tax dollars on. And that's my concern, that if we don't have any kind of new or rudimentary improvements of new exhibit space, new something, that the additional lighting, the additional cleanliness of things, it's not going to be enough to get it.
But when you do projects such as this one, and I'm in agreement with both of you, you need to think about the following. So, in addition to the container that you need to do, you need to think about very carefully what goes in the container itself, which defines most of the visual experience. Right? Now, up until this point, if you look at what we have in this building, the flexibility to create new experiences is very limited. The walls and the defining lines were drawn in 1890 and they were very hard. The layout of the building was set. What we're proposing to do is let's think about something different, the way you design a museum today. Let's polish it, the gem. Let's make sure that it's celebrated, you have the right lighting, the right experience. And now, when you bring in people inside the building, you got them in, they're in the rotunda, continue this memorable experience throughout everything they see. And that's the issue. I think we're saying the same thing differently.
Well, I think my issue is as a task force, if at the end of the day, we're going to be asked to advocate for spending X number of dollars on the museum center and the terminals, I think everything you're saying is accurate and terrific, except it's hard to sell. And it's hard to get taxpayers motivated, donors motivated. I think that if there was some kind of significant programmatic change that was going to occur in conjunction with the other things that you mentioned that are hugely important, hugely beneficial, then it would be much easier for us as a task force to go to county commissioners, to go to different corporate citizens and say, we're going to create this great museum center.
I think that,
that's where I'm
okay, I think that we need to think about it as something that we need to connect a couple of forces to get to that result. Let's assume we don't do anything to this building. Let's assume we don't do anything to the Union Terminal. You have two fundamental risks today. One is systems failing, and the building will continue to deteriorate, causing damage inside the building, exhibits and so on and so forth. continuing to spend money putting Band-Aids is becoming a very expensive proposition. Okay, so every year, in the 8 years that I've been engaged in this project, every year I see this effort to make sure that the tears are not getting any larger. You know, the Band-Aid goes on. And we're now at diminishing returns. We have exceeded life expectancies and all that. We're spending money that we should not be spending doing repairs that are lasting 2 to 3 years. We should be looking at fixing the building correctly. Full stop. If you move to another, if you say, all right, I don't want to spend any more money on the green terminal, and I go to another building, one can argue that the price tag may be more staggering than this. If you're going to do a new museum, and you're going to put it in a new location, A, you have to find a site. B, you have to create an equally memorable experience. The taxpayers are, at least in my city, if I would say to them, take people and institutions out of memorable buildings and spaces and put them into a generic box in the suburbs or in a lot with parking, something that used to be a Walmart, they're going to tar and feather us and run us out of town. And people do spend money to do museums. The problem with people who spend money for museums today, new buildings, is they don't figure it out correctly. And they spend too much money. You do have already here a memorable experience. And it's a memorable experience that cannot be duplicated easily. And the cost that you have, the investment you need to make for the building itself, by comparison, is very reasonable, and I would argue low if you would go and build a new museum. So that's one dot. Now, we can polish it, we can restore it, we can make it great. You are absolutely correct, and I'm with you. I walk in and I say, so, what did we do? And I'm in agreement with you by saying what goes in the building cannot be exactly the same what it used to be before. We need to think about what is going to be in this building that says, great, you know, it's an investment that everybody deserves.
I'm not ready to make a leap of different building or those kinds of things. I think what I'm suggesting is if the scope is limited to true building enhancement, to me, if we're going to fund that, from a marketability standpoint, there needs to be some kind of a significant programmatic change to go along with that scope. I think it makes what we're doing much more sense.
So John, all I'd say is I think those are the kinds of things that we're hoping the task force looks at. I think examines. I think that's why you're here doing the work you're doing. Because I think that's feedback we need from you, and that's why we've asked to have you as an independent group look at this entire situation and give us feedback. So you know, obviously, you know, we've got ideas, but we're here to listen to you. And so we're trying not to just project our point of view, but to listen to your thoughts and to collect those. So I hear what you're saying.
John, one thing. I know at the beginning of this process when Bob was going in, of course he just left to go meet with the county commissioners, but when he was looking to get this on the fall ballot with the music hall, he had mentioned keeping off the Science Center off of this conversation and off of the ballot for the time being, and looking at that in the future. Now, his reasons behind that, he would be able to clarify better when he comes back from the county commissioner's office, but I know that was something that he looked at and thought was the right way to go about this on the onset, so he'll probably be able to clarify that better when he returns.
If I may, the assignment of Stephen Schwartz and the design team was to look at this building and see what can be done. And to that extent, we have addressed the issues. You're asking an interesting question that is slightly different. And the question you're asking has to do with experience and content. The replacement of the roof, the repointing, the green roof, and all that are not going to have a huge impact on the experience. The experience is defined by what I see when I come in and what the kinds of things I'm exposed to and so on. You are opening a different door, above my pay grade, significantly above. But you're asking a related question that has to do with architecture. And if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying to us, if we're going to make an investment in this building, we want to make sure that ultimately, in this building, we have the ability to have memorable experiences for all of our visitors, through exhibits and all that. And that's what's going to make the difference. So I can build a very beautiful new building, a new museum. And if I don't have any exhibits, I go in and see a container. And that's what happened in Milwaukee. They spend millions, they hired Calatrava, they build this beautiful building. They don't have anything in it. So it's an experience to go and see the building. But this building has 1 million visitors a year and exhibits and experiences, in addition to have a memorable entrance, lobby, identity, and so on. So we can help as architects to a certain extent to design, restore, reshape, reposition, repurpose the building so that the experience in the future can go that way. What is going to go in here and how far you're going to push the envelope, so to speak, with the experience, it's up to you. Are we together?
We are.
Okay.
I'm trying to expand your contract.
I don't. Thank you, John, but I don't do it. Thank you, but I don't do exhibits.
Tom's contract.
I'd like to add something. I think today's public taxpayer is at a point where if we went to them and said, this is going to be a lot cooler place, that they'd vote no, or more of them would vote no, than if we went to them and said, we're going to save an iconic building in this community, and your experience when you get here will speak for itself. I think that they're more likely to, and the statistics and the surveys so far have shown that they're more likely to want to save this building. The disappointment will be if they walk in and it's a building that looks just like what they were used to. It has nothing new, like you're saying. But I think to sell it at this point, the more people are interested in, if you don't do this, we're not going to have a Union Terminal, and we're not going to have a science center and all these other things that go in. That's what my feeling is about the current taxpayer in the town.
Yes, sir. Excellent. Let's bring them on board.
So we have HGC here. They're the contractor that worked on Project One. They're going to go through what their experiences on Project One were now. Why don't we take a 15-minute break when he's setting up?
Appreciate everybody's patience and involvement today. It's been going well so far. A lot of good questions, a lot of good tour areas. I hope that everybody enjoyed this morning. I'm here right now just to introduce HGC Construction. They are the contractor that we used to do the Project One that you've heard bits and pieces about. They're here this afternoon to talk with you about what all was involved in that project, the good, the bad, the ugly, and hopefully to offer some suggestions or ideas about what they may do differently in terms of how the next project might be put together. So We've got 3 people here. Mike Bretz in the white shirt, and then we've also got Peter, and I just met him, Peter Morocco, and then Greg from HGC. So each of them are going to give you some information relative to their involvement and what all they experienced during Project One. So I'm not sure which one of you want to go first, but I'll give it to you.
Happy New Year, everybody. I was the designated project manager on this project. We were selected, well, you know, it was a public bid. We were the general contractor. And as all public bids go, we had the MEP primes under us. You know, we were slated, basically we took them under our belt and ran with the project and coordinated all their work. As all of you saw this morning, walking through the building, probably familiarize yourself with where the project was, but you know, it's the southwest corner structure, lower level all the way up to the penthouse, elevator penthouse is what we worked on, and the CDR over here, this is the same dining room. You know, since this was our very historic project, all of the guidelines were set in place and pre-construction started. It took basically a month of documentation, photo logs, material logs, assessment logs, as we took everything apart that needed to be, you know, kept or restored. Even things that we didn't reuse, like the floor closers in the historic dining room, they were all the pieces and parts were all turned over to the museum so that they could archive them and keep them. The rolling shutter here was one of the elements that went back in, just to give you an idea of, you know, the kinds of things that we had to deal with. From a restoration standpoint, the main areas of, you know, kind of the true restoration were the Cincinnati dining room and the historic dining rooms. We had a subcontractor that performed all the work. They had a couple local people that made it, I don't know, it was an advantage for us because we were able to bring them in and do the pre-testing. They had pre-testing or pre-treatment reports that they had to do, mock-up cleanings. So there's a little area where they cleaned the CDR. They tested these areas just so they could see what exactly was the method that needed to be used. All that was documented. And in that, we had our own independent decorative arts consultant that was a sub to us that we allowed, that we brought in. She was from California. So in doing that, I think if we had to do again, I would try to get something a little bit more local because although Molly was very cordial and easy to coordinate and get in, it delayed us making some decisions here and there on certain activities, I think. If there was a little bit closer, easier, a little bit more hands-on, it would have been a better situation for us, I think. But every phase of cleaning or painting or scraping was basically a mock-up was done for it. On this, the painting stripes up on the corridor for the HDR, we uncovered originally the spec pre-testing had a different array of colors because of the spectral testing that they did. As we scraped and looked at it, we realized that this is kind of the pattern that was thought to be there, and this was the pattern we found. So little things like that were, you know, is why the discovery is needed, and all the pre-testing sometimes doesn't actually pan out. So we were able to get back to the original colors of the room itself. On kind of continuing on the restoration, here's the CDR. Once it was done, we had a platform in here for them to work on. We also had a platform around the perimeter for other work. I'll show you, kind of go over that later. But once the CDR ceiling was complete, we ended up stringing protection along this vent line. Was that we used it as it ended up being the return air grill, but it's the grill that runs all the way around it. It worked very well for us to string plastic and seal that off for the continued work that was done below it after the CDR or the dining room ceiling was complete. Here's some of the finished painting on the striping. So that was, I think he took about 3 weeks to actually complete all of this. And you know that it's a small space, but it's, you know, it was multiple levels or layers of paint, and then it was silver on top of silver to get the metallic colors just right. So he spent a lot of time working on the stripes. The historic doors upstairs were taken off-site, pre-treatment reports, sampling, all the problem with those is they sit for so long that we were very concerned about internal rusting in them. So they did some stabilization, stabilized all of the paint that's on there, and then basically went back and started infilling and sealing up the doors. And I think you see upstairs. The other issue was cleaning all the metals to make them, you know, to clean them up. But there were, to what level did they need to be cleaned? And, you know, that whole process was done in incremental steps, and we had a lot of samples of new aluminum, like in all of this was all replaced in order to make that all come back to life and look like it was here in 1932. We had to pre-treat the metal. I think we ended up with maybe 10 or 12 samples of different applications of how to age the metal, you know, with assistance of the IDC, and the metal company used basically a lye bath, and we got the metal the way we wanted it. And then once we got it that way, we had to be very careful not to do anything to it once we were putting it in. So, you know, the level of intricacy on keeping the metal the way it needed to be as you're working with it and installing it was somewhat a difficult situation. We had a little bit of abatement to do while we were here. The whole ceiling around the perimeter of the CDR, Cincinnati Dining Room, was plaster out to the cove, and as that, we set up a scaffold all the way around the perimeter, and that was our working scaffold for that. The abatement team went in, removed all the plaster, and as they were doing that, you know, the plaster is attached to the lath, and the lath is wired intrinsically to the black iron. As they were taking all that apart, getting the plaster out, the black iron basically fell apart and came apart from the walls, and it ended up basically being all removed, which in turn probably worked to our benefit, because going back with new construction and the acoustic plaster system that we put back in, it made a better end product, I believe. And then the other aspect is the tar-like material that seals on the backside of all of the exterior walls around here. It's got an asbestos component, so we had to go through and systematically remove what we needed to. And that became a, kind of a scheduling issue of when to get guys in just to do the areas that we needed done, because as the work progressed around the rooms, we couldn't just do it all at one time. So that, it was a kind of a heartache issue trying to deal with that. As the project moves on, that'll continue to be, it didn't stop on the side, I'm sure, so. One of the things that we did with, is the intention was to take a temporary kitchen and sit it outside, just down here behind me on the parking lot. And as we started, looking through the process and scheduling in the pre-construction side of things, we felt like we could save some money by not doing the kitchen temporary system, and just setting up and working through and keeping the kitchen active. Now, if you ask some of the subs that we dealt with and some of the guys who are working in there, they would say, you should have put it outside. But I think from the service that it allowed the museum to maintain in all of their catering and preparing for the servery here every day, I think it worked to their benefit. There were huge, in order to get the HVAC up from the lower level, it came through the kitchen, that we added 2 huge air supply and return chases in the middle of the room, basically. And then, we had seal off around the perimeter, and we had sealed off in the ceilings, and it was kind of a constant issue of maintaining this, protection and keeping the kitchen active, dealing with the scheduling of their events every day, meeting with Steve and making sure we got everything covered for him, and the DeckerWorks people were, worked hand in hand with us and let us know if there were any problems. So, overall, I think it was a $200,000 allowance, or kind of line item, and we ended up doing about $150,000 deduct change orders for that when it was all said and done. Because the work in the kitchen would have had to have been done. It was just a matter of those, we backed the numbers out. On the roofing, we ended up using the Decathane 25 system, which is a multiple layered membrane system, which you can see we've got, by stripping down to the deck, you put a sealer on, then we put then the red topping went on, and then the membrane, the fiberglass membrane, and the white finish coat went on. This was all integral with the parapet tear down and the roof removal. And as you can see, we went around, basically went around the perimeter, took 2 feet back so that the masons could take down the rest of the wall and rebuild that as we were tearing the deck off. We kind of had to do this before the roofers were really involved, so we ended up doing some demo ourselves, and that became, it was kind of a test bed because you had the rubber, the insulation, and then you had the old tile, the grout bed, and basically a mastic or a pitch tar system underneath that was on top of the deck that we put our new system on. So as you can see here, this is pretty clean concrete. There's a little bit of brownness there, but that was completely covered with the black tar pitch, and that was all chipped off by hand, basically, to get it down to where it needed to be. We tried various methods on trying to get that off, and the easiest way was just a 3-inch chipping hammer and just working your way across it. There's a lot of square footage up there. As you can see, these guys are you know, they're tearing this out. Back here in the corner, we've got a little area done. It was a sequencing nightmare to some degree because, you know, you've got masons working up here all the way around the, you know, going around 3 sides of the parapet. And then we're, you know, tearing some off, replacing some. The HVAC's in the way. You know, this stuff smells bad. The kitchen intakes had to be shut down. You know, so there was a lot of things going on a daily basis up there on the roof. So, you know, I mean, it turned out to be a nice application and a good system. You know, the only problem is right now, from here back, that's still rubber. So we had a lot of areas where we had this joint termination of existing rubber and the new system, and they don't really you know, it's not real compatible. So we managed to get it sealed up, but there were times when, you know, where we've got temporary seals on this stuff, and, you know, we got a few severe rains, and we actually got some water in the culvert back here. So, you know, we did everything we thought we could to prevent some water from getting in, but there were a couple of occasions where, you know, it just happened that we had some leaks. From the masonry standpoint, it was, again, the same, you know, the same process and level of detail was put into every, you know, kind of every step. We had mock-ups of, you know, the brick. I think we've figured out that what brick needs to be used for the future. We looked at just about every manufacturer and every cream color brick that would work. We ended up with taking a combination of 2 bricks, blending them, and using, you know, and then using the old brick that we cleaned and salvaged. You can see here is the salvaged panels taken apart, laying on the platform. And over in that far picture, that corner is the rebuild mock-up of the parapet. So we rebuilt that little section so that it was basically like a breakaway section, so you can see where all the new flashing, waterproofing, and you know, the brick construction and the stainless steel dowels were. And once we got through that first mock-up, then they were able to continue on and start building the rest of it. And of course, we're checking sequentially as it went along, making sure maintaining quality control. So as part of the, you know, the roof system, the steel was exposed, and this is, again, cleaned, primed, and 3 phases of material that lapped up onto the deck. So once we were completely done with the parapet, the new system of the roofing would come over and run up the back of the wall, so that it was all, it all married itself together, and should, you know, last for a long, you know, yeah, a very nice system for a long time. You can see the mock-up of the panel over here. We had drawings and pictures of each panel, so that the guys could put the pieces back together just as they were taken apart. You know, they had everything laying right where they needed it to put it back together too, but it was all about the documentation and making sure we put the things together right. The hydro lift was used, which, you know, when we first thought about it, it was kind of it's like, well, it's kind of an overkill, but the way we had that, you know, 8 foot of working distance that as it went up, and, you know, if we just had scaffold there, the guys would have had a lot more staging time and move, you know, it would have been a little bit more problematic. These things cost a little bit more for rental. We had to do some engineering to make sure that we could anchor them to the building. So it was, as the towers went down, we opened up blocks in the building and tied it back to the steel. All that was pre-engineered and looked at before we did all that. And as we went through the winter, we ended up with winter protection. you know, and variable spots of logging the temperatures as the winter went through, because, you know, up here it was 80 degrees, down here it's 50, so we were constantly kind of opening, you know, venting the system. So we had one guy kind of roaming around just working on keeping the system in the levels where the specs said we had to you know, perform the masonry work. As you know, we went through and put in 40 new windows on this project. There were Hope windows. They're all steel construction, replicating the original window lines and views. They do have the thermal break and insulated glass, but you know, there's still cold windows. But when we started putting these in, we realized that, you know, where the 90s, these aluminum windows were set, they don't, you know, they're in different planes. Then those were all caulked to the brick. What that caused was, you know, a line that had to be cleaned on the brick, which, because our windows were set back, and we went through our independent or direct decorative consultant, looked at a bunch of different methods of removing the caulk. We scraped it all off with wood as much as we could get off, but there was still residue. And then we ended up from a time saving standpoint, using an abrasive wheel, a soft abrasive wheel that didn't do anything to the brick. So that saved time in removing that. So there's something that needs, you know, would probably need to be done the same way in the future, because the solvent using solvent worked on some cases, but it was so cold that, you know, it just wasn't effective, and it was taking entirely too long to, you know, remove the residue. As I was talking about on the abatement side, this is the old aluminum windows, and they were anchored back into the building, but when we came in to anchor our new windows, the anchor points were, you know, we couldn't use the same kind of anchorage. These windows were a little stiffer. We needed more. We needed 18-inch on-center anchors for the building, or for the windows. So we had to go through remove at every 18 inches as much mastic area as we needed in order to fill the voids and give us an anchor point. The engineers looked at things. We ended up grout packing all of our anchor points to get the load that was required for the pull-out. Because, again, we had the clay tile backup that has no holding qualities whatsoever. And something we found after we were done was that some of the windows leaked a little bit. Only after some of the hard driving rains that this building is susceptible to, because of the way the wind comes through here. What we found was in the design, some of the windows didn't have hoods over the weep holes, and the pressure of the rain blowing on them basically didn't let the water come out the weep holes like it needed to, and it backed up and came over the back of the window ledge and dripped down on the inside. Manufacturer came out, we dealt with our window rep, 2 or 3 meetings about everything, and they finally decided that by putting this hood on the over the window weep holes that were missing in some of them, that would solve the problem. And to date, I haven't heard that we've had any problems. So, but that goes back to the line of the window and the historic sight line. That wasn't part of the original, so that needed to be added in order to make it an operable, an operating system. The steel itself was in very good condition for what we expected. This was the urethane coatings that we put back on. we just wire brushed the steel off. Occasionally there, where the columns came up and the beams met, there were a couple that had a little bit of, you know, more erosion at the outside flange than they wanted, but a couple of cases we didn't do anything with. A few cases we added some plate to it, and that was kind of the extent of the repair on the steel. And it was just a matter of cleaning it and painting it with the coatings. The columns, the two corner columns were exposed all the way down. Once we saw this, we didn't really think that there would be any problem with the steel. But as it, you know, since it was in the scope and everybody wanted to see, you know, we wanted to document what the conditions of it, you know, actually were, we went ahead and exposed the corners. And again, the steel itself, the structural members were in good shape. We just cleaned and put a titanium coating on them and reinstalled all the masonry. The worst problem, of course, as you see, probably saw on your tour, is the lintels themselves above all the windows are basically shot on the all the upper levels. It's a back-to-back angle, and all the new stuff that we put in was stainless steel, so those should last forever. But there were some on the lower levels that were called to be replaced, but once we got into them, there was no reason to. They were still in very good shape. And a couple of them that we just replaced the front part of the angle, the rear, the split that we split them and only replaced the fronts. So there were, you know, there's kind of a cost savings in some areas like that. The two historic rooms, we used the Feller acoustic plaster system, which, you know, I don't have a whole lot good to say about that, other than it helps with the sound. As I was saying on from the tear out of the abatement, this surface here was all completely missing. So by reframing that, we were able to get a nice substrate for the acoustic plaster system. You know, this was our platform, and right about that line is where the platform of the deck for the dance floor for cleaning the ceiling was. So we had about 5 feet in here, and from here down was, you know, all of the wall feller. It's a multiple application if you're not familiar with it. It's like insulation board goes on top, and they sand that, they spray an application of cotton material on it, and then the color goes on once that's done. So it's a multiple step. It's a wet application, so there's a lot of moisture introduced into the process, and it doesn't dry well. And of course, we were in a condition here is right in February. You know, this was minimally heated in here, so we had to introduce a lot more heat than we would normally have. So there were some issues with it, and then just the application of it was tough because of the logistics of it. Then the HDR, we only put Feller in the ceiling areas around the perimeter, and that was only done with the 2 applications. So it doesn't have the insulation board behind it because we couldn't tolerate that thickness of additional material up there in the ceiling. But all of those are, you know, of course, the dining room here those are all high enough out of the way, unless you go up to the balcony, and then you're fairly close to it. So the stuff is very fragile, so it's and almost nearly impossible to repair. So those were my, out of all of the things we did here, that was probably the least favorite. Metals themselves were, you know, we replicated a lot of stuff. We had custom fabrication, finishing. You know, all the HDR metals were basically replaced. Some of these, there were pieces of some of them, so we were able to match. You know, this is all this metal, the grills, everything was We had a couple casings that were in place. We had to, we replicated some. The grill for the return grill upstairs above the balcony. All the clock letters were redone. There were just bits and pieces of everything, so we had models, so it worked pretty well. Here we had the new lock sets for the doors in the HDR, had to be machined. I had kind of a evil genius work on all those. He took them all apart, added material to them, made them fit, and put them back together, and they worked. So we had basically a half-inch gap to fill in the doors. We couldn't do anything with the doors, but we had to do the new lock sets. You just can't buy the kind of lock set that was there. This is what was there, but it's not the same type. And then we had plates that a mock-up of the plates that we made, and finally made final productions of them. So there were lots of little pieces of this, and on the restoration side that we had to do that were, a lot of fun and very interesting. Here's after we ended up with the new roofing system, we ended up with putting the green roof on. It's got the leak detection up there that runs all the way around the perimeter. You got the rubber coming up, meeting with the, where the green roof is. So there was the correlation of the two systems. This system was a very lightweight design to accommodate the structural features of the building. Put down a slip sheet, insulation, this drainage board, and then the media went down as really lightweight. When we were putting it down, I was like, I don't even see how this can grow anything, but lo and behold, it's a really cool roof now. So, getting back to the structure of the building a little bit, the clay tile infills around the structure. That was probably the hardest part to deal with, because there was, all the years of work. I mean, we ended up with a lot of this kind of stuff, and once you take that apart, and then the rest of it needs to come down. So we took a lot down that was unsafe and not really, didn't really need to be there, and repaired a lot. And in this case, this is the south wall of the CDR. Here's our scaffold. Once they abated that, this wall was kind of up and down of this broken, tile. So this is a steel plate, both sides, masonry going on up, because you could grab that wall and you could move it. And in order to go back and frame that, we didn't want, stability-wise, we couldn't justify that. So this was reinforced, and then we were able to put our new structure in for the CDR ceiling. From probably one of the most worrisome parts of the project for me was right above the mural in the CDR, we had this ductwork that was, and an RTU that we took off the roof. So where he's standing is where the ductwork came through, and we created this platform underneath. So we're hanging our platform, and there's the black iron and the backside of the plaster of the mural. So we were working in that confined in order to fill this hole and get the deck, put back in this concrete, and pouring concrete on top of the mural. I mean, we structurally enforced it, and it really wasn't that. It was just a process, but just in the back of your mind, you've got this, mural that you can't replace, and you're pouring a bunch of wet stuff on top of it, and hoping that nothing goes wrong. So, and nothing did. We survived that one with no problem. Mechanically, we put a new system in the basement. This came in as one piece, and within an inch or so, it came through the overhead door. We left that wall, the end wall of the room, out so we could, install the unit. But it was designed so that, the rooms that were being fed could have little or no, sound from the air blowing, which in in turn made all the duct sizes a little bit larger than we would normally install. And in doing that, here's the return above the CDR, and our acoustic plaster was like right here. Well, all of the beams in the building drop down. There's a lot of void space up there, but we can't run our ductwork up and down all the time. So we're constantly dealing with this parameter of the bottom of the beam to the top of our ceilings. The offices, basically, this might be Steve's office. We kind of kept the roof line where it was, and this is a trunk line running up to the backside of the CDR. There were very large units of ductwork that really required a lot of coordination and processing that, I know the engineers did a lot of forethought, investigation of the space before they, but as we went through, it was just like, it seemed like every room we had to modify or adjust the ductwork to make it work, because there were just things that were in the way that, just wouldn't work. From an electric standpoint, all the existing fixtures were replaced or were retrofitted and reconditioned. We put new CFL ballasts in, new mock-ups of the glass and things like that. So, and all the lighting was recreated in order to make a better lighting system. All the controls were new, Lutron control systems, and I don't know if you guys went in the room up by the corridor and by the HDR, but there's 4 big boxes on the wall, and they're all just the controls for the lighting. Some of the issues we had was adding lighting down in the CDR. There's no space behind this wall on the south side to get access to this, so unless you're really skinny, there's a kind of a chase back there, but I couldn't convince I was going to put a picture of the electrician on here, but I thought he wouldn't have appreciated that. But some of the fixtures were new replications that and then like I said, we replaced a lot, and there were mock-ups came in and made sure everybody was good with what we're going to replace, and then once this was mocked up and okay, then the whole system units were all of them were taken out and refurbished. So. And then I kind of went through the cost of what the project was originally, and kind of backed out all of the accessory costs of things that were added of additional work that necessarily wouldn't be a change order to quote project one specific. And we had about a 3% increase over the original budget of things that we encountered that had to be addressed. So I don't know how that, information impacts going down the road, but maybe that's a number that can be, maybe a 5% is a good number for looking at, future contingency and things like that for your project. So, anybody got any questions about it?
Yeah, again, I'm Mike Bretz. I'm one of the partners with HEC and engineering background. So as you can see here, there were a lot of bits and pieces, a lot of from mechanical down to the brick, down to the refinishing, making door locks. There were a lot of different pieces that just as an overall, it seemed like we had to figure out on the run. As a kind of a lessons learned. I know this project was publicly bid, so right off the gun, we're having to deal with some subcontractors that we might not have wanted to deal with if we were in more of a negotiation standpoint. There could have been a lot more planning, coordination with us, with the historic people, with the MEP people, the structural people. like Greg mentioned, the ductwork, it was a constant problem, and some of the designers were out of town, so there's always a time lag for us to coordinate problems and issues that came up. So for example, I know it was with the public money, there's a certain way that these things are procured, but any way that you can get the experts on board early to work some of these things out, to pick out a window, to go through all this process of mixing bricks and finishing metal. It's I think it'll make for a lot more fluid of a job. The historic aspect of it, why I'm history buff, but that if you were going to categorize all the costs, you'd have to put a big column in here just to deal with historic. I don't know if that can be simplified some way with the contractor designer earlier on, and there were consultants that hired consultants, that we had to hire a consultant. I mean, it was just dealing with a lot of out-of-town people, and this was Project 1 was a small job. So maybe with a bigger one, all that's handled differently. I don't know. But it was a good job for us. I think they're still happy with us. And Greg, he wore a lot of different hats during this project. So again, any questions or comments you guys got, let's see if we can answer them. Okay? Yep. Thanks. Thanks, guys.
Another question, so, because if you didn't do this and you learned as you went the first time you did it, then it was not a very big large piece of once you got another. I mean, how much different would that be, do you think, in terms of, so if you're scaling out and you're doing it, think about 10 times, 15 times more of that around. Is that something you really think you would pick up a lot more efficiency in that process, or do you think it just kind of is what it is based on the kind of work it is?
I think you will pick up some efficiency by, from a scale factor, but when you look at a lot of the areas that you have to get to now, we had pretty easy access on this project. You start to think about, the high bay above where the train people are, your recesses in and around the building, you're gonna incur some additional problems logistically, staging and making sure that as the work progresses, you're not redoing or going, you're not overlapping. So I think in that regard, you may not be able to, you're going to gain so much efficiency.
In a phasing aspect, I mean, that's, although we were given that wing except for the kitchen, we still had, the museum center was active. We used the same door for deliveries. Security is a big deal. Everybody's badged and signs in, which was part of the project. But I mean, if all the windows are the same, there's an efficiency. But if all the windows are different, especially different materials and different, there's not. And that's hard to. I would think in the, if there were some consultants maybe assigned to that full time, I think that would, which they probably would be on a good job, I think that would help facilitate some of the questions.
Mike, how much of that work can be contracted was about off hours?
No, there was some.
Well, they operate on they come in early or prep, and they were usually done by 2:30, 3 o'clock. So we did a lot of work, from that point on, or we came in early and set up and got inside the enclosures and didn't really, you know, deal with them from that standpoint. But there was a lot of overlap.
To Mike's point, by engaging the people earlier on, Doug, I think that's where some of your efficiencies will come into play. By instead of a sort of the bid situation you had last time, you can get more people involved and anticipate some of the things such as the phasing and some of the details. So you can address it in a more efficient manner and you know, negotiate with some of the specialty folks out there earlier on. That's where your efficiencies, I think, would come in, and I think that's what you were alluding to, correct?
Yeah, for example, I guess I know some of my colleagues here are used to this every day like we are, but for example, trying to get the right guy to restore that mural in there on bid day, you know, if we had a couple of weeks to get everything together, and of course we were talking to people, but on bid day, you get a price comes in from Joe whoever to redo that mural, and it's just, there's a lot of judgment that has to be considered at that point, that if you could avoid that, I think you could have a lot more confidence in moving forward.
Steve? Somehow pulling together yourselves and George and Art, understanding the expectations that they had to make going in with the X-ray vision goggles, and then as you started to undress this beast, what you found and what we should be assuming might be the same, might be different, might be worse as we work our way around the building. Conventional wisdom is that, you know, prevailing winds and weather comes from this side, but I've heard that the north side of the building is actually worse.
Well, you know, one thing structurally, I think there's a lot worse parts in masonry in other parts of this building than over here, and you might find some steel that's more corroded than we did. Do you think that's right?
Very possible. We repaired a little bit of space over on the north side for those offices, and you know, I can tell that the conditions are much worse from what we dealt with here, even though the weather is kind of a driving force right here. I don't know if there's a vacuum on that side of the building or what, but.
Is there anything that you had to do in Project One that in retrospect, maybe it didn't have to go quite that far, or, I mean, and I would actually ask the same question to George.
He's down there.
Sorry, thank you. What did you find that either validated or in some cases that we can all learn from, that maybe we don't go quite so deep, or we have to go deeper into the next project?
Thank you. I think that you're asking 2 or 3 different questions. Before, if you don't mind, I would like to ask one question. And I apologize, I had to step out for a moment. But I want to ask one question. And if you already answered it, I apologize in advance. We produced a set of documents and a series of assumptions for the work that you performed. Did you find any surprise that it was completely a surprise, nothing that anybody expected? The answer is yes or no. Yes or no?
Yes or no.
Okay. Where I'm going with this is an important piece of the discussion for us, all of us, because we did, as you know, a series of ND, non-destructive evaluation of the building, testing and so on, and we made a series of assumptions. If we found any major surprises, this is something that needs to be factored into the discussion. So if the answer is no, it's great. If the answer is yes, we need to know that.
Well, I think the design team is on board, is well aware of what we encountered and what we did, George. I guess to my point, there was a lot of details that I would, we'd hope could be worked out. For example, anchoring of windows.
You need?
I'm sorry, you can't. I just said I would hope there'd be a lot of the details that could have been worked out ahead of time. Nothing like, you said the wall was here and it was over there, nothing like that. It was all, and the clay tile was not too good a shape to use for any structural things. And, yeah, it was a good job. I'm not trying to be negative here. Just,
No.
But I do think the process, the historical aspect, complicates things. I mean, that's given. So
I think that you bring a very interesting point that we need to connect to the previous discussion that took place before you arrived. Some of the participants asked, what is the relation between historic spaces and preservation work versus non-historic work in the building?
Good point.
And one of the reasons why we picked the zone where he worked, because it was really one of the toughest in the entire building. And if you look at the building very carefully, there are only two areas where we have similar conditions, where he worked and exactly the opposite on the north. So as an overall percentage of the building, the area that you worked on and the area that you did not work on, it's on the north side, it's about 10% of the total area of the building.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when some of the historical projects we do, they'll consider this corridor historic, and the rest of the building's not. I mean, and that isolates that complication of the project, that corridor. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
We understand. So now we can go to your question. If you don't mind rephrasing it.
You say, rephrasing the question being that, again, how differently would you recommend we plan for the balance of the work, given that there is less historic work in the balance of the project?
From a pure construction standpoint, I think we pretty much acknowledge that some of the main structural steel on this side was in good shape, and just like taking down the corner completely, those kinds of things probably wouldn't need to be done on some other areas. If you could look at maybe doing spot checks on them, I mean, that would probably be a good way to cost save, or to think about not having to be so so destructive to the building. I mean, the corners start to everything's starting to blend and look better now, but when we were done, it was kind of like those really stand out. But so as you proceed around the building, I think investigation would be probably bringing a team on and doing some of that spot investigation on a small contract basis would probably may be very beneficial in the big scheme of things.
As part of the
a lot of money.
As part of the documentation process, perhaps.
Yeah.
Instead of waiting till the build.
I mean, George and his team there, I mean, they're the experts on this, all this historic stuff, and we learned a lot from them. So don't want to minimize that, but there's a lot more than I thought there was going to be with the documentation, but now we know.
If I may answer your question, because it was directed both to HTC and to the design team. On a personal basis, what we learned from the first project were about a half dozen important lessons. Number one, I think we have now a more precise performance expectation sequence of implementation and details for the masonry work and the steel. Because we did the probes, we did the non-destructive evaluation, we actually did the actual work, and we see now what the fine tuning needs to be. So that's number one. Number two is we were very apprehensive and we needed to be very careful about the windows because you're placing a very small number of windows in the context of the entire building. When you do the project in its entirety, you're going to have economies of scale for the windows, and you're going to have a better competitive environment because more people are going to be participating. And B, you're going to have a larger quantity that is going to reduce the cost per unit. You also, at that point, you will have the ability to do a better mock-up test for the first unit to tweak all the pieces and then do the entire installation throughout the entire building with the understanding that you have two conditions in the building. One is the condition we have in the first project with decorative areas, and the other is a condition that is non-decorative areas. The next thing that we learned, which in my opinion is very important, is what is the margin you have in trading loads in the slabs when you remove topping and everything so that you can do the new roofing installation. There were assumptions, we did probes, we did certain things, but what we learned from the actual construction was invaluable. So we know a lot more today. We're very confident about all the flat areas around the building. Because the exterior envelope repair and steel and parapets need to happen in a specific way, in my opinion, there is an advantage to putting together a package that has the parapet, steel repairs, slab repairs, and roof as a single package that coordinates all the details. And if you look at the photographs and the lessons learned, essentially you have pretty much all of the conditions that you may encounter when you go to the rest of the building. The issue that was very clear is that it relates to what we discussed earlier this afternoon. The placement of the air handling units throughout the entire building needs to be done very carefully because in some areas your margins are very tight. And you need to think about it in advance, layout and everything. In fact, you want to do it in the schematic design at a level that's equivalent DD or higher so that you know exactly what happens because the placement of the units is extremely tight. The benefit we had as a team, as a design team for the entire building is we pretty much saw, I would say 90% of the materials that are found throughout the building. In this area, with the exception of the variety of the wood species that you have on the north side, we have seen here about 90% of the materials that are found throughout the building. So the treatments are understood. We may have to do some tweaking, but you understand the aluminum, the granite, the terrazzo, the plaster, the acoustical plaster, everything. You know? So.
That's it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, guys. This place is, we're all hometown guys, and this place is like in our genes here. You know, my grandparents, I got pictures of them out there. So we just like to stay involved, whatever we can do. Thanks.
Great, thanks, guys.
So CR Architecture, they're not able to attend today. So now, I mean, we can open it back up for more questions from everyone and kind of continue the conversation. Are there any more questions for the design team or the museum center that anyone wants to ask? Okay, so there's a dinner tonight at 6 o'clock. We got through the program a little bit quicker than we had expected. I think we're going to wrap it up for now. Tomorrow there's a criteria analysis that's going on. It's a pretty intense session of figuring out what needs to be in and what doesn't need to be in. So we want to start when everyone's fresh tomorrow instead of moving on to that now. So everyone's still welcome to come back for 6 o'clock for dinner, but in the meantime, we're going to break for now, and feel free to explore the museum or check out a IMAX movie, but we'll see you back here at 6 o'clock. Thank you.